at some point in the near future, once we've wrapped up. A little bit of details on just the process and what the overall agenda will be. Everyone is going to be on mute automatically. We ask that people post questions in the chat, and we're going to hold off on answering questions until the end of the staff presentation. However, at the end of the staff presentation, we do have a fairly substantial amount of time allocated to Q&A. We'll read those questions in the chat and then respond to them directly here. And we'll make sure that we clearly kind of remind people to do that and how they can do so going forward. So for those that want to give the chat box a try and that are unfamiliar with it, feel free to type into the chat what type of organization you represent, and just test it out and see how it works. And so with that, I want to turn it over to staff Jelena Hartman, who is a senior scientist with the State Water Resources Control Board. We also have a number of other State Water Board staff joining us today, including Amanda Montgomery, who's the program manager for the permitting program, Andrew Dieringer, an attorney from our Office of Chief Counsel. And before we go too much farther, I also want to note that there were a number of other staff that helped produce this report, including Jimmy Steele and Scott Frazier, and a thanks to everybody that helped participate and go forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jelena, and thank you.
Hi, thank you, Eric, and indeed, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your days to follow this effort along, to tuning into a webinar, and to help us with crafting our way forward on climate change and water rights. Ultimately, our key goal with this effort is to support our water rights applicants for new appropriative water rights to develop projects that will remain feasible into the future as long as possible. And as Eric said, we will start with the staff presentation, and I will just kind of give a nod to people who have put into chat. We have people from GSAs and water utilities and other representation. So let's just go ahead and get started. We will set aside time at the end of the webinar for comments. And we do have actually kind of bookend. We would like to receive written comments by the end of this month. So we released this report in early February and presented it as an informational item at a board meeting. And in response to that discussion that we had at the board meeting, we extended that comment period and scheduled the webinar. As those of you who have read it might have questions, and those who have not read the report yet, we hope to just provide an overview and then entice you guys to participate and help us with your ideas. So for some general background, and we really won't spend much time on this, the board adopted a resolution in 2017, and that was board's way of giving direction to staff to take actions to support key states' priorities related to climate change. Among other things, the Division of Water Rights was asked to make recommendations on how to account for climate change. And the water rights piece was one out of the suite of 30 action directing staff to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to increase water supplies through water recycling and reuse, stormwater treatment, conservation, efficient water use, find opportunities for increased storage, ecosystem benefits, and so forth. So just for perspective, the water rights effort here is only really a slice out of the broader effort to address climate change in the Water Board's work. That specific direction to the division was to identify data needs and evaluate and make recommendations on regulatory and policy changes regarding the use of models to account for projected impacts of climate change when conducting water availability analysis and shortage analysis. Now, we have two pieces here. We have water availability analysis, which is related to permitting new water rights. And it's taking a long term in asking a question, is there water available for appropriation after accounting for senior rights and in-stream needs? And because this is really a long view of water supply, there is a potential for changes in hydrology that are projected to come with climate change to affect this analysis. And this is the focus of the report. The other piece here is shortage analysis. And shortage analysis is asking a different question. It's about managing existing demand. And it's looking in the immediate term, is there a shortage of water supply? Is there enough to meet existing demands for senior water rights and to protect public trust resources? And this can, during shortages, result in curtailment of junior water rights. And this general view of shortage analysis and how to approach drought is a topic of another effort. And I wonder if, Eric, you would like to talk about the water rights drought effort review or the water effort just really briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Jelena. Just to reiterate what Jelena has highlighted, we have recently undertaken an effort to look at what occurred in the 2014-15 drought periods and to understand kind of what stakeholder needs were there and what the division could respond to more quickly or in a different way in a future drought, potentially as soon as this year. That information was compiled into a document called the Water Rights Drought Effort Review, or WARDER. And that document is also available on our website. And I think we're going to post a link to it in the chat shortly. And we urge people to take a look there. But to reiterate that, the shortage analysis is really focusing, I think, on that drought component and how do we respond to drought. This report and this effort is looking at how we approach new appropriations and new permits going forward. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jelena.
Sorry, that's right. As Eric said, really from that direction from the board to look at the water availability analysis and shortage analysis, there are two distinct pieces. And in this report, we are focusing on this permitting piece and relating to the new appropriations. And so we have a poll to find out who, with respect to water rights permitting, we have in the audience. So Kian, if you can please launch that poll. Let's give it a few moments for folks to respond. Answers are coming in. We're generally looking at whether you can select the best answer. There might be multiple answers, whether you are planning to file for a new appropriative water right, if you have a pending application, if you're an existing water right holder, and if you perhaps are tuning in for other reasons, no water right and no plan to apply. And we have about 2/3 of all the people who are attending putting in their answers. We can end this poll and show the result. Generally, there are quite a few water rights holders on the call, and definitely a segment of people who are the main target are those who are planning to prepare a water right application, are also in attendance, and then a nice share slice of others who maybe participated in our process. So thank you, Kian. We can end this poll and let's keep moving on. We'll get to the report itself on the next slide. So it's taking us a bit to gather steam here before we start on the report. But it's probably helpful and important to lay out what the report does and does not do. And so this report does aim to create a framework within which we can assess key challenges due to climate change and then identify data needs and approaches to make permitting of new water rights more robust. And the report also takes a broader look, a little bit outside of permitting, but to propose actions to get to a more resilient water future. What the report does not do, and it became apparent that maybe this was confusing at some point, and we would like to clarify this. The report does not change any definitions that's in the statute or regulation, and the report does not change existing water rights. The report also is not a summary of the cutting edge science. We recognize that that's a moving target and requires a separate effort to track and to be up to speed. And so this is not necessarily a place to come to and find the latest and the greatest. We took well-established basics of climate change science, aiming not to be really that go-to summary of the latest developments, but to provide the basics on water rights, provide the basics on climate change, and then make the report a place where we can put these pieces together and then chart out the way forward. And with that said, the report does not detail all actions that need or should be taken, but we kind of took a stab at really bringing these two pretty complex topics, water rights and climate change, and tried to start to blend them a little bit more. So the report is titled Recommendations for an Effective Water Rights Response to Climate Change, and it focuses on that permitting water availability for new water applications. And for completeness, we felt that including other actions related to water rights and climate change made sense. So other actions that could more broadly support an effective response to climate change within the existing water rights framework for California, we also tried to incorporate those in the report. And so for the remainder of this presentation, we'll really just try to follow along with the report through the 6 sections: water rights overview, permitting water availability analysis, climate change and water resources, look at some select data for California. And then after laying out key challenges and opportunities in managing for the future, we will look at those staff recommendations that were the main outcome of this report. So first up, it's water rights overview. And I do want to say that we aimed to have this be easy to understand. And I like to say, I would like to be able to explain to my neighbors what it is that we do. So we aimed for plain language summary and a cursory overview of water rights in California, just enough for the purposes of orienting the reader who is maybe new to water rights. And for background, California law distinguishes between surface water and groundwater. And the State Water Board does not have authority to issue permits for groundwater diversions, except for a narrow category of subterranean streams. But in the report, we are talking about surface water. And a water right is a legal permission to divert and use a reasonable amount of water, which must be put to a beneficial use. And water rights in California are based on a priority system that's used to determine who can continue taking water when there is not enough water to supply all needs. And that priority of a water right is particularly important during a drought, when some junior water right holders may be required to stop diverting to ensure that adequate supplies remain available to in-stream needs and senior diverters. And so California recognizes several different types of rights, such as Pueblo and federal reserved, riparian, appropriative, prescriptive water rights, but most surface water rights fall into one of 2 categories: riparian rights and appropriative rights. And these riparian rights generally come with land that has always bordered a water source, have a higher priority than appropriative rights. There is an exception for some appropriative rights that predate California's admission into the Union, but riparian owners can use natural flows directly for beneficial purposes on that riparian land. And in a time of shortage, they are of equal priority to other riparian rights. So they must share available supplies among themselves during times of water shortage. Now, riparian owners may not store water during a wet time for use of during a dry time. And the other type of right is appropriative rights that are based on the principle first in time, first in right. And an appropriative water right will carry a priority date that will determine its seniority in relation to other water rights. And that means that a user is entitled to the full quantity of water specified under their right before a junior appropriator may exercise their right. And so this report focuses on appropriative, my computer is frozen, appropriative rights, and about permitting new water rights. But while this is pretty short and pretty brief, we provided some resources here for those that are interested to explore more about water rights. A really good starting point is Division of Water Rights page, the top link, which has a list of pages that might be useful and provides background and a lot more information. And also, as a part of its public information program, the State Water Board also publishes a collection of California statutes pertaining to the law of water rights. And these booklets contain sections from the California Constitution, the California Water Code, and other related codes which can affect water rights decisions. So for those who want more, hopefully this will put you on the right track. Okay, so back to surface water and permitting new appropriative water rights. Essentially, any person or entity that seeks to divert and beneficially use a reasonable amount of surface water may file an application to divert and use water by permit. And if you already have a water right for your project, you do not need to apply for a permit. So if you don't have enough water or you don't have a water right, this is really for you. And then a water right permit is an authorization to develop water diversion and use project, and it will specify important things such as priority date, and then also quantity, rate of diversion, season of diversion, where and how and for what use the water can be taken and applied, monitoring, reporting, and other terms and conditions such as terms to protect in-stream flows and other water users. And all these are developed during permitting. And when we talk about permitting, there is a step before permitting, which is developing an application. And that step, when you're thinking about applying for a new water right, is really one of key steps for a party that's interested to seek water right. And it's critical that appropriate season, rate, and quantity of the proposed diversion are requested at the time of application. In Spotlight here, we have California Code of Regulation, section 699, which essentially says that once a party has submitted a water right application, the amount of water requested and the proposed season of diversion cannot be increased. And so with this in mind, we would like to encourage applicants to consider how climate change might affect their project before filing their water right, just to ensure that if there is a potential for their project to be affected by climate change, they take that into consideration and develop a project that's climate resilient. And they have a water right that can support their project as long as possible into the future. And in deciding whether to issue water rights permits, the State Water Board considers the features and needs of the proposed project, all existing and pending rights, and in-stream needs to determine whether there is water available for appropriation. And notably, there are cases when applications are not accepted or permits are denied. So for example, a permit might be denied if the project is found to be not to be in public interest or it unreasonably harms the environment, fish, wildlife, water quality. The State Water Board is also precluded from accepting application in stream systems designated as fully appropriated. And I'll talk more about this in my next slide, but the permit would also not be issued if there isn't water available for appropriation. So even if a stream is not on the fully appropriated streams list, water may not be available for appropriation. So back to that fully appropriated streams concept, just a bit of information on this. The board adopted a formal declaration that defines the critical reaches of each fully appropriated stream system. So a fully appropriated stream system would be that where there is insufficient supply for a new water right application. And streams can be fully appropriated year round or for part of the season. So here on the screen, there's a screen capture of our geographic tool where you can look up your location. And generally, these red areas are fully appropriated year round and blue areas are for the part of the year. So there's a season where a stream system might be fully appropriated. And with some exceptions, declarations that a stream system is fully appropriated encompass all hydraulically connected upstream sources that contribute to that stream. When you look at this map, you should also note that the absence of a fully appropriated designation does not indicate there's water available. But generally, coming back to that consideration, board is unable to accept applications for new water rights in these stream systems unless the designation itself allows this under specified conditions. So there are conditions when parties may petition to open a fully appropriated stream listing. And I just mentioned it here because we will come back to this later in recommendations. But for those who would like to find out more, there is a link on the slide, and hopefully Kian is posting these resources in the chat box for you. And moving on, next we have a section that will give a pretty rough overview of the permitting water availability analysis. California law requires that every application for a water right permit demonstrate at the time of filing that there is a reasonable likelihood that unappropriated, that's unclaimed water, is available to supply the applicant. And the complexity of this initial showing depends on project specifics, such as project size, amount requested compared to estimated supply, and so forth. And an applicant typically conducts a much more detailed permitting water availability analysis during application processing, because as we already kind of mentioned, a prerequisite for issuing the permit is that there is unappropriated water available to supply the applicant. So that detailed analysis is usually taking into account both in-stream uses, such as fisheries and recreation, and senior applicants and right holders. Now, this permitting water availability analysis is really important because the board has to make that finding that there is unappropriated water available to supply the applicant before a permit can be issued. And permitting water availability analysis generally comprises two major steps. One is to estimate supply as unimpaired flow, and the other one is to account for demands for both senior diverters and in-stream needs. And this analysis is not limited just to the point of diversion, but typically includes multiple points along the flow path between the proposed project and downstream limit of the analysis, such as bay or the ocean. And so we have this equation that is really a deceptively simple view of supply minus demand, and then we have to answer what's unappropriated water available for appropriation. But there are a number of nuances, challenges, and limitations. And the first part, just looking at estimating the supply as unimpaired flow, we have multiple challenges. So one of them is that sometimes applicant is working off of a fairly short period of record. So there might have been a gauge at a location that was active for a few years, and then it no longer has data. We can also have a situation where the project is in a gauged watershed, but there is no gauge at the exact project location, but maybe that location drains into a gauged location, and then there are methods to kind of prorate those flows and use those data. But oftentimes we will actually have a stream system that is entirely without a gauge. And fewer than 15% of the state's significant stream segments are well gauged. So applicants have to figure out how to estimate that unimpaired flow in the absence of data for their stream. And so there are a couple of options. Applicants can find a similar watershed with similar characteristics that's gauged. There can be use of precipitation and drainage characteristics to generate estimates of runoff for that watershed. But the gist here is that often we are in a situation with not enough information to characterize multi-year or decadal hydrologic variability, which can then significantly limit the ability to have a reliable estimate of water availability. On the other hand, we have that second part of the equation, which is demand. Demand includes senior right holders and in-stream needs. And this situation is also complex because senior right holders includes existing rights and any pending applications that are senior to the proposed project. And from the accounting standpoint, this can be a component that requires some putting pieces together as a puzzle. So for water rights issued by the board, the so-called post-1914 appropriated rights, we have a database with a face value of the right to use as the demand for water availability analysis. But demand also includes parties who have water rights that are not issued by the state board, such as riparian rights. And for those rights to determine demand, one has to go on case-by-case basis to review the diversion reporting to represent demand of those riparian water users. And applicants can rely on data in the Electronic Water Right Information System, or ERIMS. And it can be helpful as a way to assess that senior water demand, but that system itself lacks modern tools to have accurate and high quality data, and also just requires a bit of investigation each time to put together what the demand is. And remember, we're looking not only at the point of proposed project, but then along the downstream path until the limit of analysis. And then the other crucial part are in-stream needs, because even if an applicant can demonstrate that there is unappropriated water after accounting for senior diversion, well, that water may not be available for appropriation if there could be impacts to fish and aquatic and riparian species. So we're looking here again at essentially a gap in data. Only limited areas of California have a set of in-stream flow standards, and applicants end up working out an approach on a project-specific basis and may develop specific information for their project, but this can be pretty labor-intensive, and parties may need to quantify the timing, quantity, and volume of flows to protect fish and wildlife. I do want to note that we do have one area of the state covering parts of 5 Northern California coastal counties where the board has a lot of pending small permit applications, but there is a policy, North Coast in-stream flows policy, that provides an approach to water availability and sets regional criteria for protection of resources. So that can be an easier way sometimes for applicant to prepare their application. But in the absence of those criteria, applicants would be left to develop those for their own specific case. Next, the report provides information on climate change and California's water. And here, again, we have a complex picture even before layering on climate change. California has strongly seasonal climate. We all know that our winters are wet and cooler, and we have hot and dry summers. And the state is large, spanning multiple climate zones. And we really have large hydrological variability throughout the state. And in addition to this, when we look at our annual precipitation, there is a really wide variation, year-to-year fluctuation in the total amount of precipitation. So there is a long-term average, but any one year we can get as little as 50% of that long-term average or more than 200% of the long-term average. So this kind of gives us an idea why a short record may not be able to capture all that variability and give us a good, reliable water availability picture if we don't have enough data. Before we continue with this section, we do have a poll just to get a sense of what region you work in. If we can launch that poll. Okay, please vote. We have a poll that's just giving our main drainage basins and also hopefully offers enough granularity to see where we have people from today. All right, we have answers coming in. About 2/3 have voted. Let's give it another 10 seconds before closing the poll. All right, so let's end the polling, and we have people from all over the state. This is really great. There are quite a few people from the North Coast and Sacramento River, and then we have a really nice representation from the San Joaquin and South Coast, the Bay, and a large number actually has work that applies statewide. Great, thank you so much. Then we are all ready kind of to apply our own lens when we think about some of these projected changes, because these projected changes in climate and hydrology will be unique and different for each region. So when we talk about this following information, it's fairly generalized. We do know that statewide, we have documented impacts of climate change. We have experienced a pretty severe drought just a few years ago, followed by record wet years. We know that these extremes are projected to continue to occur. And looking at more long-term trends, annual mean temperatures have increased almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit statewide during the last century. And we are seeing that trend continuing in the models that are showing the temperature change in the future. And due to that warming alone, California will continue to see more shift in the baseline hydrology. So we're not looking just at these hydrologic extremes of flood and drought, but we are looking at our wet season projected to become shorter. So condensed wet season where maybe all our precipitation is coming during shorter period of time. And then even with the stable amount of total annual precipitation, if all of that moisture is condensed during a short period of time, the balance of the year is going to be dry for a longer period of time. And then warming itself has quite an impact on snowpack. There is an unambiguous trend towards diminishing snowpack. We expect that arrival of warmer temperatures earlier in the spring will cause snow to melt earlier, but warming also causes a greater share of precipitation to fall as rain instead of snow, which then also contributes to earlier runoff. And changes in runoff have already been documented with shifts in both timing and magnitude of flows. So we'll just take a moment without spending too much time looking at some of the key changes that are documented and what the future looks through the lens of climate models, records indicate that our year-to-year variation in the annual precipitation in California has intensified over the past century. We have more distinct dry and wet periods, and maybe there has not been a change in the overall annual precipitation, or there's very little trend. We do have that intensified change from year to year. Climate change modeling also suggests that we will continue to have our seasonal patterns, so wet winters, dry summers, but we might have greater precipitation extremes. So models generally, and I don't mean to make things complicated here, but the total amount of precipitation could go either way. Some models indicate a decrease while others point to an increase in the overall amount. However, while we are not sure exactly how much precipitation we will get, we do expect that the wet season will bring wetter conditions during a shorter period, whereas that dry season will become longer and drier. So on this slide, kind of like in the left on the text are documented changes, and on the right-hand side, we see winter and spring precipitation, which are projections for the end of the century. And so the chart on the left is December, January, February. So we have winter precipitation, and these green colors show an increase over the long-term average. So we see that December through February is wet or slightly wetter, and we see that more wetness increasing in precipitation is in the north compared to the south. So on the right-hand side, we are looking at March, April, and May, and these yellow and brownish colors show a decrease compared to long-term average. And we see that these dry regions are projected to become even drier, and wet regions might get wetter. But we also see here that move of precipitation during a certain part of the year while the balance of the year is drier. In terms of snowpack, we expect less snow in lower and intermediate elevations and just more precipitation coming as rain. With warming, that's a trend. And again, on this slide, the text on the left shows documented trend. It's been recorded that we have been having increasing percentage of precipitation falling as rain since 1940s. And what we can expect, again, is that by the end of the century, we will have less snow, more rain, earlier snow melt, and we can expect Sierra snowpack to shrink to half by the end of the century. Even if we don't have a change in the overall amount of precipitation, if more of our precipitation is coming down as snow, we will have that moisture runoff sooner in the year. And that brings us really to shifts in pattern, volume, and timing of runoff. In the Sacramento River system, the peak of the average monthly runoff has shifted earlier by nearly a month between the first half and the second half of the 20th century. And with warming, we have that pattern, volume, and timing to continue to change. So these two charts are from CalAdapt, which is an online portal that hosts climate change data developed by the state. And we can look at just the chart on the left. The black line shows the observed stream flow. And then the other 4 lines are 4 different models that are considered to capture the range of variability we can see. There are a lot more models, but these capture kind of like bookends. We have the wetter model, drier model, average model, and one model that captures these conditions that are not represented by other models. And what we can see here is that that peak stream flow is happening earlier in the year. We also see that these flows are getting to be much higher. But I do want to draw your attention to these areas below the black line, where in these months, in spring and early summer, we actually lose those stream flows. And that's one of the things to bear in mind as we move on to recommendations. Now let's spend a moment looking at select models and data for California. Because a lot of information is already out there, the state has invested in a considerable amount of research to understand how a changing climate will affect water resources, and then identify ways to build resilience and prepare for those impacts of climate change. So our report highlights two sources of existing data, and both of these cover a historical period that's modeled to see how well the model is able to capture what we already observed, and also then include projected climate conditions with a variety of hydrological data. And the first one up is the fourth climate change assessment, which was completed in 2018. As a part of this effort, there were several projects to improve access and presentation of climate change information. And the analysis further refined projections for California and provided higher spatial resolution and improved treatment of climate extremes. And the climate simulations that are developed for fourth climate change assessment are in the public domain. They're available on CalAdapt in multiple formats for download. And data cover projections under a couple of different scenarios, but they provide daily temperature and precipitation, relative humidity, wind speeds, surface solar radiation, and also estimates of various hydrological variables such as snow cover, soil moisture, runoff, heat fluxes, and so forth. The other notable source are Sigma climate change resources. The Department of Water Resources is really a leader in this area. They have developed climate change data tools and guidance to support the implementation of Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And these Sigma climate change resources are in the public domain. They have been made available to the groundwater sustainability agencies to use during the development of the groundwater sustainability plans. And the climatological data include precipitation and reference, evapotranspiration. The hydrology data includes unimpaired stream flows for major streams in the Central Valley, and then stream flow change factors for smaller ungauged watersheds and for the rest of the state. So as a starting point, an applicant may be able to incorporate climate change information directly into their application without having to run models themselves or develop additional data and information independently. So they can just rely on what the state of California has already developed. Okay, so we're ready to move on to the next section. We're close to the kind of culmination of the report where we put together that water rights piece and the climate change piece. So I hope we now have a picture of what sort of challenge the climate change might pose to water management in California. It will increase the things that we have been dealing with all along, and it will bring some new challenges. So in managing for the future, it's really important to think this through, because from farmers and ranchers and irrigation districts and water suppliers to cities, hydropower, recreation in man-made lakes, the water I just drank and the breakfast I had this morning all depend on someone who has a water right. So being able to protect and exercise those water rights while protecting flows for the environment is really important. And so we laid out what sort of projections, what sort of direction the projections point to in terms of long-term shifts and amplified hydrologic extremes. And the report looks at how do we use these changes in hydrology to get to a more resilient future? And we can just start by looking at the hydrologic extremes. The first one, the one side of the hydrologic spectrum of the extremes is drought. This has been a part of California's past. People have managed, and it will be part of the future. And droughts can have quite far-reaching effects, as we have already seen during the recent drought. And drought affects existing water right holders and management and protection of the state's ecosystems. And while we can't make droughts not happen, we can plan and prepare for them. So with droughts projected to become more severe and last longer, the State Water Board might need to implement curtailments more often and in the increasing number of watersheds. And as Eric mentioned early on, with respect to the border report, the State Water Board has already started these efforts to evaluate and assess actions from the recent droughts and use the lessons learned to inform responses for future droughts. Now, there are also some options that could help us prepare a little bit better, such as developing tools to identify functional ecosystem flows, to come up with a rigorous and transparent curtailment framework, and kind of lay out the protocols for decisions, and also develop adaptive permit terms that maybe get triggered during declared drought emergencies and so forth. And if we look at the other end of the hydrology extreme spectrum and floods, we generally, based on climate models, expect those future floods to be somewhat different from past floods in timing, frequency, and magnitude. And that could have critical consequences for reservoir operations, water storage, and water availability. But managed well, our groundwater can provide a crucial buffer against drought and climate change. So there is substantial opportunity to prepare for and capitalize on flood flows by storing them underground. Recognizing this potential and that capturing high flows is an important approach to build resilience, the State Water Board has issued guidance on water rights permitting beneficial uses that are associated with groundwater recharge. Excuse me. The State Water Board has also developed temporary permits to divert and use available water that has not been claimed by a water right holder during those high flows. And there's also, from a couple of years ago, a new streamlined standard permitting pathway for those that plan to divert high winter flows or flood flows and store that water underground. And in addition to these things that we already have, we also have a significant opportunity to leverage studies that are ongoing. The Department of Water Resources, I already mentioned, is the lead in developing data and updating and refining regional flood management strategy in the Central Valley and for implementation of managed aquifer recharge under the banner of FloodMar. So hopefully this is a hopeful look at these hydrology changes, that they're not going to be just a challenge, but that we can plan for the parts we can't change, but then use and take advantage of the parts that we can. And now let's turn to recommendations. There are 12 staff recommendations, which I do need to note are preliminary and they range in complexity and workload. Some of them are fairly small things we can do. Others are really big, wide, broad efforts. And some of these are already underway, and some will need further exploration and engaging with stakeholders and with the board. And these 12 recommendations offer a menu of options to account for climate change in permitting, to make water availability analysis more robust, and then to support an effective water rights response to climate change that kind of goes beyond permitting. So I'll just spend here a moment to remind us all of the permitting water availability analysis, because first, several recommendations are directly related to this. We already discussed challenges a bit related to supply and demand, but the gist here is that often we have to rely on record that's not sufficient to capture the full range of variability and to evaluate water supply as it is today. And then on top of that, we have climate change with rising temperatures and changes in hydrology that come with that. And climate change is likely to affect when and how much water will be available. And because our water rights take a while to permit, but these are typically long-lasting, we have twofold reasons to think through how to do analysis ahead of time. So one, we can improve long-term feasibility of projects, and two, we can ensure that terms and conditions in the new permits can provide continued protection of environmental needs. So the first four recommendations are directly addressing permitting and climate change. These chart out the main elements of the approach to include climate change into analysis when somebody is applying for a new appropriated water right. And we can implement these types of improvements to analysis within our existing authorities by applying them on a case-by-case basis on individual applications. So the first one is to require applicants to use existing climate change data in permitting water availability analysis. We already looked at two main sources of data, but obviously, if there are better data or if applicants wish to develop their specific modeling work that's better suited for their area, that would work as well. The recommendation is also to implement these requirements for climate change analysis on a tiered system where complexity would be based on project characteristics, so type of demand, size, and so forth. And then for parties that conduct climate change analysis as part of their permitting process, recommendation is to include adaptive permit terms in those new permits that get triggered when a certain hydrologic threshold is met. And then a recommendation to develop a fact sheet for water right applicants, because we realize that really the key here is to work together with applicants and to help this process along. And we do want to educate applicants how climate change can affect projects and why to consider that in preparing an application. But key here is to start by asking applicants to look at the readily available data for California first as a screening point. And then as we start to see applicants working through this process, we can share their examples with other applicants. We've already gone ahead and put together a water rights climate change webpage. There are links to those data sources that we covered in the presentation. And the page also includes the report and a fact sheet for those who are considering applying, but may not have done so yet, providing information how to address climate change in their permit application. And then there is also instruction how to provide feedback on the report that we are discussing today. The link is there, and hopefully it's also available to you through chat. Next, couple of recommendations focus on strengthening the supply estimates, especially if the gauged record is short or there are no gauges at all. Oftentimes, our applicants will use the entirety of the record, but sometimes even that entire record is not long enough. So pairing those short records with nearby gauges, using multiple gauges in similar watersheds, requiring more rigorous methods to extrapolate the data, these kinds of things would help us get a better picture of that supply component of the equation. And in these three recommendations to improve water availability evaluation, I guess we keep coming back to the data issue and accounting of water, because in having a robust analysis, we need good data, and in being able to manage for the future, we need good data. So these three recommendations are approaches that would position us to have better data and better evaluation of the water availability, regardless of climate change. For example, expanding existing network of steam and precipitation gauges would obviously give us just more data. And some of these efforts are already underway. For example, there is effort underway to implement Senate Bill 19 on stream gauging. But these kinds of things would give us tools to make better informed decisions. And it would help us in permitting and our applicants. On in-stream needs, we recognize that climate change could further change needs of aquatic species over time. And these efforts could support both permitting analysis as well as real-time management of existing demands. But we aren't planning to open up criteria now. Really, this is just something we need to monitor as it might become a need. And research and development of scientific literature that would assess the impacts of climate change on fish species would be needed to implement this recommendation. And finally, there are fully appropriated streams. I'm now going to ask you to remember things that we looked at in previous slides. As the run of timing and magnitude change, there could potentially be more designations needed during the spring through fall due to changes in runoff and precipitation timing. And if you remember the chart where the black line was the observed record and then the modeled stream flows were all shifted earlier in the year, well, that black line that would then lose those stream flows, in those areas, we might just have additional designations of streams that are fully appropriated. And any new designations would be relevant for new applications and would not really have effect on existing water rights, but it would really remove ability of the State Water Board potentially to accept applications during those times in streams that experience that change. And conversely, you remember those peaks were coming earlier in the year, but they were really tall. And some fully appropriated streams may need to be reopened in order to allocate those winter high flows or flood events. And parties can petition to revise the fully appropriated stream declaration to allow the acceptance of an application of a new right, which can then be processed as that designation is lifted. So helping applicants understand that they maybe should not be filing during certain time, having that declaration updated, and as we receive more information with applications might lead to those list revisions. And we're in home stretch now. There are 3 recommendations that are left. We have challenges cut out for us with climate change. We already talked about how we can use some of those changes to our advantage by preparing for and capitalizing on those high flows, flood flows, and storing them underground, and by just planning for the drought. And then there is also an enormous potential to harness ideas and solutions by coordinating with other agencies and partners. And as already noted, some of the topics in the report are much broader than permitting water availability. And we added them into the reports just to be comprehensive. And these broader topics may have their own efforts, and coordination here is important as those efforts move forward. Specific to permitting water availability, coordination especially focuses on working with parties like the Department of Water Resources that have and continue to develop data sets that may be used by our applicants. And then in closing of the report, we also now choose to highlight this final recommendation once again, because it is cross-cutting recommendation that applies quite broadly. We have a potential to strengthen everything we do, to partner on research development of tools, funding projects and research, innovation, coming up with voluntary solutions. And this coordination might have challenges of its own. It can be messy, but it's really the main way we can ensure that we're making sustained progress and are coming up with lasting solutions. So that's it for the overview of the staff report. We have about 1 hour left for our webinar, and we plan to open it up to questions and answers. But before we turn to questions, please give us a heads up if you plan to have questions or plan to comment by responding to the poll. I know some of you have already been typing in your questions as we went along. That's really great. All right, we have about half of the participants responding to this question. Let's give it a few more seconds before we close the poll. Okay, it looks like we have several questions. We don't have very many people who think they will submit verbal comments, but quite a few of you will plan to submit written comments. Let's end polling and share the result. So thank you for your questions ahead of time, and also thank you for your comments you plan to submit. We can move on to the Q&A. Let me see here. We would like you to continue to type in your questions into chat. You have so far been able to only direct your questions to panelists. And we'll get Eric or Amanda to read questions, but I do want to say that we will save a separate block of time for comments after this Q&A part in case there are people who would like to verbally express their comments. So Amanda and Eric, do we have any questions? Could you unmute and maybe start to read some of those?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amanda Montgomery. So I'm going to start reading the questions. We have a few that have come in. As a reminder, as Jelena has mentioned, if you have a question, please type it into the chat. I'm going to read the questions without identifying who asked it, just for time. So the first question we had was, will the Water Board be proactive by encouraging development of more groundwater banks, new and expanded reservoirs to capture early precipitation, and a statement of the reactive regulatory hammers, e.g. curtailments, should only be available in an emergency, but not as a solution. So I'll take that question. The State Water Board prioritizes work on processing applications that support SGMA. And that could include projects that where there's a district or GSA that's diverting and putting that water underground, such as on-farm recharge. It could also include a groundwater bank. In terms of new and expanded reservoirs, we also receive projects like that in permitting or perhaps a change petition. I also note that with climate change, it probably becomes increasingly important to consider using our existing aquifers as reservoirs for storage. So that's response on that question. And then the second part was just a statement. So that was our first question. Moving on to our second question. So this question was, rather than asking water right applicants to quantify in-stream needs, Can the SWRCB or state board perform this task? It is needed for the state board to uphold its obligations pursuant to the ESA and public trust doctrine, especially in management of existing water rights where low flows are leading to extinction. For that question, I will pass it along to Eric Ekdahl, our Deputy Director.
Sure, and just a quick note that, of course, the board in its permitting actions is going to consider public trust and ESA and other environmental issues, including whether or not it's in the public interest. But even today, we see applications come in that completely exclude any discussion or consideration of in-stream flows. And what this recommendation is really getting at is that applicants need to do a better job kind of doing their homework before they come in. That's going to help the application go more quickly. And I think it's going to help us, kind of set expectations, and the applicant can kind of better develop their own expectations of what's reasonable and what's not. We're going to need to start considering, when new applications come in, water quality control plans, including Bay Delta and work going on there, other work going on in water action plan streams, and just consideration of public trust flows in general. The state board is working with a number of other agencies, including Fish and Wildlife, and then some academic groups and NGOs, in developing something called the California Environmental Flow Framework, or CEF approach. And that's looking at how we can maybe look or put out some more baseline environmental flows at a regional scale, and maybe move a little bit more quickly in some of those efforts. But the kind of other issue in setting those public trust flows is that it takes a very long time to do. With our current process, it takes a lot of science, it takes a lot of background, and there's a lot of public process in it. There's a lot of due process in it to actually kind of incorporate those into, say, a regional flow criteria. You have to go through a water quality control plan update process, involves CEQA, involves a board adoption. So there's a long process that goes with that. CEF may look at kind of providing some additional details, but it's not a shortcut to that process. And if applicants are able to do some of that work up front, I think it will help both us and the applicant in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Amanda.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to move to our next question. It is, will any of the proposed modifications impact the perfection of an existing permit to a license? And I can take that one as the head of permitting. So what we're talking about today is focused on permitting for new water rights. So parties who've turned in an application to acquire a permit. That's when water availability is done to determine if there's water to supply the project. So it does not impact a project that already has a permit. So the answer to that question is no. We're talking about improving the process that's involved when a party has an application and they're collecting information to support reasonable likelihood to acquire a permit. Okay, let's move to the next question. So our next question is, can you explain again how this affects the state's means of curtailing existing water rights if necessary? For that question, I'm going to hand it over again to Eric Ekdahl.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks for the question. Going back to what we touched on at the beginning of the presentation, the main focus of this report is looking at new applications and new permits going forward. But in a broad sense, it's useful in noting how climate change in general and the projected hydrologic outcomes that come from it could affect the curtailment process. What Yelena highlighted in the presentation was that we can expect longer droughts, more frequent droughts, and maybe even more severe, punctuated by these brief, intense wet intervals. And if we are, and I think we very well are, looking at a scenario where we're seeing more frequent droughts of more severity, then that's going to, by necessity, affect how frequently the board looks at curtailment type options and when and where those are necessary. I think there was a statement earlier in one of the questions about, the curtailment should only be used very sparingly. And I think that, I'd maybe like to reset expectations in the other direction. If you look at where we've used curtailments at a statewide level, we've done it in 1976, 77. and we did it in 2014 or 2015. That's not an overuse of curtailments, and that's not an over application of it. If in fact anything, I think it's an under application of it. There are much more likely to be watersheds where some type of action should have been done in the past and wasn't. And so we may be in a scenario where we need to look at curtailments more frequently and kind of how we do them and how we look at those types of approaches. And I use the word curtailment here in the broad sense of notices of water unavailability and the whole due process that we have at the board. But it's just something to kind of flag for the future. So nothing in this report or the recommendations itself inherently drives how we look at curtailments, but it's the information and the underlying premise that climate change is going to result in drier conditions, that it's going to affect what we do. And I'll hand it back to Amanda.
Great, thank you. We did have a request in the chat to repeat the questions twice. Some of our questions from here on out get a little longer, so I'm just going to speak slower rather than repeat twice. So the next question is, Table 1 of the report indicates that 56 new applications with a combined face value of 11.2 million acre feet. How many of these new applications are proposed for the Central Valley hydrologic basins, Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Tulare Lake? And what share of this total acre feet is in the Central Valley basins? For that question, I'll hand it over to Yelena. Thank you.
Hi, I actually don't have the breakdown by basin off the top of my head, but I hope we have contact information for the question. And there's actually a way to look up information on our ERIMS database, and we can definitely follow up offline. I am not able to give out of those large applications where they are right now.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, the report states, and this is a quote, "In order to continue to protect and preserve fish and wildlife habitat with changing hydrology due to climate change, it may be necessary to modify existing in-stream flow criteria and metrics required by the North Coast in-stream flow policy for applications and petitions on existing rights. This will likely require developing tools for identifying functional ecosystem flows and further development of scientific literature that assesses and plans for the hydrological impacts of climate change on anadromous fish species." And then the question is, "I recognize that this is a draft report recommendation, but I was also wondering if the State Water Board has given any thought to what form this might take and whether it would require amending the policy. Thank you." For that question, I will answer it directly. So the North Coast in-stream flow policy has protective fish criteria called regional criteria. And those regional criteria were based on the scientific literature and review that was done for that policy development between about 2005 and 2010 in a document called the Scientific Basis Report. Our recommendation here is reflecting that it's possible that in-stream needs would change over time and that additional literature would be produced that would lead us to adjust the regional criteria. And so our recommendation makes space for that reality that it may occur in the future. It is unclear if that documentation would be produced and if that need would arise. But if it did, in that hypothetical situation, we would likely amend the policy at that time and update the regional criteria as needed. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to keep going through the questions. Our next question is, when can expect implementation of recommendations which seem important and long overdue? Thank you for bringing them forward. The risk to protect species is ongoing and is only getting worse, and hopefully the state can avoid future harms. So for this question, I will hand it over to Jelena to talk about the recommendations and next steps. Thank you.
That's a really good question. I appreciate that. Generally, the report has not included priorities within the recommendations, and that's open to the discussion, input from stakeholders, and also thoughts from the board. However, we have already started to work with a couple of applicants to include climate change in their water availability analyses. We provided the data and the fact sheet for those who are considering to apply for a water right, because we do think it's important to think through which aspects of your project might be able to be modified so that if that hydrograph continues to shift and we see those changes in hydrology, we don't continue to count on sustained diversions during a period of year when there won't be any more flows, but maybe enable a project to, during a shorter period of time, take at a higher rate. So in my mind, the highest priority is really to start thinking right away and start to do things that we can do. We can't see the future, but we know what types of changes are projected, and we would like applicants to think about those, because once they submit an application, some of those pieces that get set in stone, we don't want to have regrets about those selections 20, 30 years into the future. So those would probably be the highest priorities, and it is the low-hanging fruit that we can start to do right now. For the other projects, especially the ones that are large undertakings and require a broad stakeholder involvement, obviously we would need to scope those out, but making sure that we are set up to take advantage of the flood flows, we kind of thought ahead, and the board has adopted those streamlined permitting pathways and temporary permits. We are really trying to proactively encourage that acquisition of those waters, and that's kind of what I see, but obviously this is one of the reasons we are reaching out to you and asking for your input.
Great. So our next question overlaps a bit with our last one. How will staff incorporate the new climate change analysis requirements? If an application were submitted tomorrow, would staff require different requirements for water availability analysis than currently included in the CCR, or California Code of Regulations? And I'll answer that one. So Jelena did provide a robust answer that covers most of this. I would point out that the California Code of Regulations provides a framework for making a showing for reasonable likelihood of water. In much of the state, how a party does water availability analysis is something that's worked out with division staff for their specific project. And as Jelena mentioned, we are working with an existing applicant to already include climate change. So I don't think it changes so much the requirement from one day to the next because of our report, but we do strongly encourage applicants before they file to consider climate change, and we'll be working with existing applicants to be incorporating climate change considerations into their water availability analysis where it makes sense. And as Jelena mentioned, one of the recommendations is for tiering that according to various factors, such as project size or geographic location. And I also would note that there is, where we have most of our very small applications and the largest number of applications based on number count, that area of the North Coast does have the North Coast in-stream flow policy, which was mentioned earlier. And that policy has a defined approach for water availability. And in my view, that approach can encompass consideration of climate change. So we're not having to change our regulations, laws, or existing policy to implement this report on a case-by-case basis for existing pending projects. Okay, moving to the next question. So what are some of the current deficiencies of the ERMS database with respect to new water availability analysis? So with that one, I'm going to hand it over to Yelena.
Okay, so I will just be really brief on here. Anybody who has tried to use ERMS has to work with puzzle pieces. One is getting the face value, and as I mentioned during the presentation, not just at the point of the proposed project, but then going downstream flow path at various points of interest until the limit of analysis. That in itself is pretty challenging. But that's for the water rights that are issued by the State Water Board. For the riparian water rights, it's really like a bit of an investigation, and it's difficult to do that work. And oftentimes we have overlapping claims and different combination of rights that makes it really a challenge to have a clear picture of what is the senior demand in that watershed. So ERMS has had issues with accuracy and data quality and regulation that the board adopted. There is work to improve ERMS, but we are aware that users may be getting data that, depending on what you're looking for, might have issues.
Hey, Yelena, I'll jump in and I'll add a bit more here since this is one of my favorite topics, and I'll try not to go down too much of a rabbit hole. The issues with ERMS are complex and kind of multi-nested. It's not just an ERMS problem, it's also kind of a authority question. There's some policy issues embedded in there as well. Long story short, ERMS was kind of conceptualized in 2002, 2003 timeframe, originally to help track fees. And when we put together the original budget estimate for ERMS, we said it's going to cost about $10 million to do. We got about $2 million to do it, maybe 3. So it's never been funded appropriately. It's never had the investment of resources that we need to actually do what we need to do with it. Right now, in particularly the COVID era, all of our records are held on paper record. So we have staff working from home that can access files. It's not a geospatial database. There is an element to it that people can access online that does incorporate some GIS elements, but it's not integrated. We can't really track or QA/QC some of the reporting elements appropriately. And so long story short, it takes an immense lift at the staff level to kind of understand who's using what water, where they're using it, the appropriateness or the priority of that right or claim of right, and how it factors into how we're going to permit things going forward. So long term, there's, I think, just an immense need to kind of update ERMS into more of a 20th century approach. It's very outdated and clunky and difficult to use, which makes it kind of trickle down to everything else we do. I'll stop there, but always happy to talk more about water right data and ERMS issue at a later point.
Okay. So the next question is, does the division have plans to develop a complementary report to address shortage analysis topics? Are there new topics or policies being considered to facilitate implementation of water right priority system through curtailments? And I'll hand this question over to Eric.
Thanks. So I get my video started back up. We have a whole bunch of things that we're kind of doing. We don't anticipate a new report. I mean, that report is the water report that we highlighted earlier. It doesn't necessarily go through a step-by-step plan of here's what the division is going to do, but rather it lists out the issues that were identified during the last drought. And we're using that even already to kind of help identify places where we need to invest some additional resources, whether it's staff time or actually at this point it's mainly staff time, but also getting better data, getting a better understanding of how we look at just water use statewide. We have some things I think teed up in the next 2 to 4 months. I don't want to really go into them here, but the release of kind of a visualization tool I think is anticipated maybe sometime in April, and that will let users go into selected HUC 8 watersheds to look at what we have in terms of reported data and number of rights and priority of right, and kind of play around with where they are in that priority schema. We are looking at contemporaneously releasing a methodology that talks about how we look at cleaning up our own data. And then over the next 6 to 18 months, looking at some tools that have been developed by some of our cannabis staff, cannabis policy staff, in modeling initial supplies and addressing some of the kind of geographic issues that occurred during the last drought, where we're trying to curtail at a watershed scale, but how do you incorporate flows on different streams within that and balance priority appropriately? So we have some additional methodologies that we're hoping to kind of roll out for a public view and a public opportunity to kind of offer feedback and comments. Stay tuned for additional updates on those. And again, we anticipate doing a very public-facing outreach effort for each one of those in the near term.
Thank you. So our next question is, what formula does the state board use to balance environmental needs versus state economic and societal needs? And then part two, you mentioned the Bay Delta many times. When will the water board commence the water rights phase to implement water quality criteria? So I'm going to have Eric answer the second part, but I'll answer the first. So there isn't a formula to balance environmental needs versus societal and economic needs. But what we do have in water rights permitting, when we're issuing a new permit, is a requirement based on case law coming first from the Mono Lakes area, and then from other case law, to consider the public trust doctrine. And so the public trust doctrine is in-stream needs and other needs such as aesthetic or recreation. So we balance that versus the other benefits of the project. And we include reasonable protections of in-stream resources. And so that's done with new permitting. And then I'll hand it over to Eric to address the question about when the State Water Board will commence a water rights phase to implement water quality criteria.
Thanks. Yeah, as folks are probably aware, the board did adopt an updated water quality control plan for San Joaquin tributaries in December of 2018. Since that time, we've been working on kind of the implementation of that plan, but also working as part of a multi-agency effort to negotiate voluntary agreements, not only for those tributaries, but also the kind of broader Bay Delta watershed. And that right now is the primary focus of state and other agencies' efforts. And so for the time being, we're not moving forward on, say, the Sacramento portion at this time. And we'll see where things go in the near future. But again, that's kind of a multi-agency and administration priority to focus on the voluntary agreements for now.
Thank you. So our next question is, how can riparian rights be better managed to take advantage of increased winter flow magnitude and decreased dry season flows? I know the focus here is on appropriative rights, but stream adjacent parcels with riparian rights will play a big role in adaptive flow management. And I can take the first crack at that, and Eric can weigh in after me if you'd like. So as Yelena mentioned in her presentation, riparian rights do not allow for storage in a season of plenty, like the winter, for a use in a drier period. So riparian rights are not used for things like above ground storage reservoir or underground storage. That said, there could be some role of riparian rights for direct use on that parcel for irrigation. So that's my response. Eric, would you like to add anything?
Nothing to add, no.
Okay, we'll keep going. So the next one I will be directing to Eric. Does this analysis affect the proposed change of diversion for the Delta Conveyance Project?
Maybe I'll start, but Andrew Dieringer, if you're on and you would like to help respond to this question. So the Delta proposed conveyance project would result in changes to Department of Water Resources water rights and move a point of diversion up into the Sacramento River watershed, in part, at least as it's been described, to help accommodate for potential climate change effects such as sea level rise and other, I think, not viability, but to be a little bit more protective about issues that could occur in the Delta, such as if there's an earthquake and the loss of Delta levees and other kind of salinity driven issues. And so at kind of a high level, does it change that proposal? No, but is climate change something that will likely need to be considered in that project? I would say yes, while understanding that there are a lot of folks working on that very question right now. What does it mean for projected water supply, existing flows, and other work in the Delta more broadly? So nothing here is going to result in a new policy requirement or a new change to a regulatory requirement, but I think from a high kind of just my own editorial perspective, it seems like a worthwhile thing to add. Andrew, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
Only to emphasize that because the Delta Conveyance Project, the legal form that's taking is as a water right change petition, it's technically outside the scope of the recommendations contained in this report. But as just to emphasize the point that Eric was making, that my understanding based on previous iterations of this project is that changes in hydrology and climate due to climate change will factor into the analysis of the changes involved in that project. But as it's it's pending or impending at this point, it probably isn't appropriate for us to comment in too much detail on that project while it's in that stage.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, how do you see these recommendations being adapted, used for aquifer-based water district considerations? And I can answer that question. So when I read this question, I read it as a district that is using the aquifer as a water supply. So as Yelena mentioned in her presentation, our focus is on permitting, which is surface water. So to a degree, the question was about groundwater, overlay groundwater, that's kind of outside the purview. But to the degree that the question is about storing surface water in an aquifer, which is a solution that many parties are considering in response to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, then those parties, many of them will be pursuing new water rights permits. And these considerations will be really important when they're trying to have surface water for long-term sustainability of their basin. So they're going to want to be looking at climate change and what that pattern of supply is expected to be into the future. And as Yelena mentioned, we do have a fact sheet to help applicants start to think through before they apply in what they're asking for based on consideration of climate change, so they can have a resilient project. Okay. Moving on to the next question, which is related. Do climate change related recommendations apply to applications for temporary permits, 180-day or 5-year, or WAA, which is water availability analysis for streamlined recharge permitting? So 180-day temporary permits are just for the next 180 days. So climate change, I mean, maybe there's some role to consider climate change there, but that's more just an immediate need for water looking at current hydrology. 5-year, again, it's more of an immediate need. There may be a role for looking at climate change there if it makes sense for the project. But generally, it's not you're not looking for a permanent authorization. So I'd say there climate change is kind of limited need to look at, though there may be a case where it makes sense. For water availability for streamlined recharge projects, so that effort that we embarked on a few years ago that we have available for streamlined processing through the standard permitting pathway is about acquiring a permanent water right. So there it is important for the resiliency of the project to be thinking about climate change, because the party is looking for a permanent authorization to divert. Okay, moving on to the next question. Are there any other current plans for enhancing / repairing existing stream gauge networks other than those associated with SB 19? I know it has been said in the past that enhancements associated with the bill could take 10+ years. Thank you for your time. So I think I'm going to pass that one on to Eric to see if he has any comments on that. From Yelena's and I side, we're tracking the issues regarding stream gauging, but the work is being done by others in our division. Eric, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just note that there is a kind of active process right now going on with SB 19, but Amanda, as you accurately described, SB 19 doesn't actually result in any new gauges. It's just a planning study, essentially, and any implementation would require another set of funding to basically implement whatever recommendations are there. It's an active topic. A lot of people are really interested in it, and I think there's broadly recognition that the state needs more gauges. But right now, we're working on SB 19, and other agencies or other groups may be working on kind of how to move more quickly on installing or getting more gauges where needed.
Okay. So we had a note from one party just pointing out that in-stream flows are a economic and societal need, and wanting that correction. And that is true. It's definitely correct. When I was speaking about the public trust doctrine, I wasn't meaning to convey a competition there, just that the basis for the public trust doctrine, and which comes from lawsuits and then those considerations, is putting that space into the permitting process for consideration of in-stream needs. So let's keep going. So we have a question here. Recent analysis of the latest generation of climate change models, known as CMIP6, provides information on interpreting climate simulations as scientists develop more sensitive and sophisticated projections of how the Earth will respond to increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Researchers found that models with lower climate sensitivity are more consistent with observed differences in temperature between the northern and southern hemisphere, and thus are more accurate depictions of projected climate change than newer models. Has staff considered the studies supported by the Carbon Mitigation Initiative, CMI, and developed in Princeton's High Meadows Environmental Institute, HMEI? And for that question, I'll direct it to Yelena.
So this question is something that first we appreciate just how engaged and how aware our stakeholders are and careful, and we want to apply same attention and be as careful as we implement the recommendations that are in this report. And the California Energy Commission has recently awarded a grant to Scripps to fine-tune models for California and for that next generation of models, and to provide data for the 5th climate change assessment. And they're our main partner who is going to evaluate and track the performance of these newer generation models. And really the gist here is that the model usually is used to simulate a historic period and compare it to the observed record. Can that model perform well in California, which has such complex hydrology, and then also to offer projections? And sometimes a model of this new generation can potentially have really good performance simulating this historic record due to a different thing, not because it's really good at simulating California climate. So that's kind of like, I think, the gist, what this comment is bringing up. The report is sticking not to that new generation, nor are we saying to go out and grab the first thing out there. The data that are available right now are using more established science. And as I kind of referred to, it can be a moving target, but we are going to be talking with our partners at the Energy Commission and evaluating what does it mean and what are we going to do with these models going forward. But yeah, thank you for bringing that to our attention. And we are definitely not wanting to reach to something that are new things, maybe not yet proven. What we've put in the report and the data that are recommended are like such solid data. And even the old projections for California, like 10, maybe even 20 years ago, we with more refined modeling have not gotten different projections. We just got them to be more refined and more of finer spatial resolution and temporal resolution. But we were getting a pretty similar picture with those old models. And I want to make kind of like an analogy between a Duplo block, which is big and tiny little Lego block. We used to work with Duplo blocks, but now with the models that are recommended, that are the data that are in the report, we're essentially building that same shape, but with those finer, smaller blocks. And so we will carefully assess recommending any new models before we understand what they really mean and what the repercussions are.
Thank you. So our next question is, can you please provide specifications regarding the level of detail that will be expected for water availability analysis that includes climate change? Considering the resources provided by the state board, this type of analysis will probably have qualitative and quantitative components. So for that question, I can respond to it. So it will be based on a case-by-case basis. We do have on our webpage some resources that are readily available that parties can use to get started. And we stand ready to work with applicants as they start to do this analysis. And as we work through these on specific projects, that will help build cases of examples that we can share with others. So, okay, moving to the next question. So this includes a statement followed by a question. So the statement is, policy needs to stop water siphoning from both surface water and groundwater, and to control large agricultural users and other large users from wasting fresh water. It is important to find solutions regarding supplies to existing residents and other grandfathering in rural area usages. New uses and users' impact should be fully analyzed before permits are issued. Additionally, water quality is definitely an issue. What is being done to clean up existing contamination problems and prevent future contamination? So there's a few issues there to the issue of contamination. So contamination issues infers to me water quality concerns. So if there's contamination issues, it'd definitely be something that would be worked on by our regional water quality control boards. Also, other state agencies might be involved with contamination. For the larger context of a commentary about the need to fully analyze new users. So that's what the permitting process is for looking at the project that's proposed. For all new water right applications, there's a public noticing component where the public becomes aware of the project and can protest. The board, as we've mentioned in today's talk, looks at, is there water available to supply the project in consideration with existing in-stream needs and protection of existing senior diverters. And there was also a remark in there about the need to grandfather in existing residential type uses. And we do have a type of water rights called registrations that are specifically for very small diversions. And one type of registration is for small homeowner diversions, the small domestic registrations. And registrations are for small amounts of water and have a less rigorous process to go through to obtain them, commensurate with their lower risk and the need for those homeowners to have water supply. So let's see. That is the last question that I'm seeing. So with that, I think we're through our questions. And I do note that in our poll, I think we noted something like 8 questions. And from my count, I think we had about 20. So that's a great turnout. And I was really happy to see that. With that, I'll hand it back to Yelena.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks for all your questions. Those are thought-provoking, good questions. We did mention we'd set aside time for comments. Nobody really in the poll indicated they wanted to offer comments verbally. I did want to just put up this slide to really encourage everybody, to the extent they have ideas, comments, suggestions, to electronically submit their comments. Our comment period for written submittals is through the end of month. Again, we actually don't have a deadline for a good idea. If there's like a fabulous, fantastic idea coming at a later date, don't keep it a secret. But really, if there is anybody who maybe changed their mind and wanted to offer comments verbally, we will open it up now. You can raise your hand and Kian can unmute you. But if we don't have any additional comments or question, we will then be closing out the webinar.
And Yelena, this is Amanda. We do have a late breaking response to a comment we couldn't answer. So we have been doing research as we've been doing the webinar. And so the total volume of pending applications in the San Joaquin Tulare is, in terms of acre feet of water requested, is 9.2 million acre feet. And it's 21 applications. And that was data that we compiled previously, so about a year ago, but it's generally about the same now. So thank you for that interruption.
All right, thank you. And it does look like we have one person who would like to speak. I'm going to be inviting you to unmute, Chris. So Chris, if you are getting...
Can you hear me? I tried to unmute.
Yes, excellent. We hear you.
All right. Yes, I did come in late on this. I was hoping to ask a question, and if I'm being redundant with someone else, please just interrupt me and tell me it was already answered. But we've been, the North Coast Stream Flow Coalition has been a long time protestant in the water right process on water rights that we think are continuing to dewater streams on the North Coast. And in particular, we find that there needs to be more regulations through the water right process, so that when we're in drought, people must curtail. And at present, the curtailments are slow in coming, and there seems to be the Department of Water Resources goes through whatever internal process they go through, but by then usually the streams are dry and the fish are dead. So with climate change, it seems to me that there needs to be a better trigger and a better process and better enforcement, a whole better program to step in on water rights and keep the fish in good condition, and try to keep water in the stream for the fish, and curtail as necessary. Is this an opportunity to do that? Oh.
Hi, Chris. Sorry for the silent moment there. So the question is really related to the shortages, curtailments, and stream flows. And the comments that you have, I encourage you to send them to us in writing. I'm not sure how much of the discussion you missed. I will ask if Eric maybe wants to summarize the work that's going on related to curtailment. But we did talk about it a bit. So for the part that you were providing comments, please writing, and I'll turn it over to Eric.
Hi, sure. I'll just really quickly update, drought and the issue of kind of water use and how we go about evaluating supply versus demand is extremely complicated. I think I would be in agreement with the general idea that we need to be able to better understand when demand exceeds supply and how existing uses, particularly in these high resource value streams or priority streams, where diversions are affecting stream flow and affecting public trust flows and endangered species and other ecosystem values, as well as other senior rights. And we're working on a number of tools currently that I think are going to help us in that longer term. But ultimately, it's about data, and it's about understanding who's using water when, and understanding the accuracy of diversion data that's been reported. Right now, we have significant challenges in that data. We figure at a watershed scale, it's accurate plus or minus 40% in some areas, maybe even worse in some, better in others. That leads to immense challenges. And we're actively going about trying to figure out how to prioritize potentially problematic data, follow up with those diverters, but at the scale that we're talking about with 40,000 plus reported water rights in the state, probably a fair number of unreported diversions as well. It's a fairly, not something that's going to be done overnight. We're in the process of doing it, and look forward to kind of additional communications and discussions and any support that can be offered. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, and thanks, Eric. We have time for one more comment, and we do have one more person with requests to speak. Mr. Fisher, you will have 3 minutes for your comments. You should be asked to unmute.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, to the authors of the report, thank you very much. This is very much needed in the history of California. It's one of the more comprehensive analyses of what has been done and what needs to be done to do essential supply-demand assessment to determine when water is available. My comment is more on the realm of defending the rights of non-humans and future generations and endangered species. I think this report points out what needs to happen to determine whether water is available, but I still would like to maybe come back to the responsibility of the State Water Board to quantify and enforce in-stream needs. Eric did point out the CEFF, but I would like to point out that the people in charge of the CEFF are doing an amazing job. However, it is expressly not intended to provide enforceable in-stream flow requirements. And that is kind of what has been going on since the early 80s. We study what fish need, but then ultimately do not give it to them. I think the North Coast model is really good in that it provides a regional percent of flow approach expressed as a percentage of unimpeded flows. I'm not sure the enforcement is good, but I think that model, I would suggest, is what should happen throughout California. Baseline minimum in-stream flows expressed as a percentage of unimpeded flow. We don't need more science, we need the political will. And I think that the crisis of climate change hopefully will provide the impetus for us to collectively do that. There are tributaries to the Klamath that still get dewatered every year. I've been watching it for 20 years. We have the science, we know we have the law, and what's missing is political will. So North Coast as a possible model, we need a regional percent of flow approach. That is the default across the board. So hopefully that can happen. And again, thank you to the authors for this amazing report.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Fisher. With that, we have really actually come out to the end of our webinar. This concludes the the material we prepared. Hopefully we got to your questions. Please feel free to reach out to us if there are additional questions. We encourage you to submit comments, and thank you again for sticking around until the very end. And we will be closing out the webinar in a minute.